His rule of Uganda, 30 good years. The opposition have already started complaining. They say the vote is rigged.
And I'm sure you have been shown, many of you, a sample of the predict ballots which were being carried around by some of Museveni's supporters. Predict in favor of Mr. Museveni. These were found out just outside the polling stations.
Security has been tightened in and around the capital city, Kampala, where majority of the opposition supporters are. There are fears that the opposition would bring people out to protest against the victory of President Yoweri Museveni. And the government is saying it's not taking any chances and will not allow any such demonstrations to take place.
Some news from Europe now, and around 200 protesters braved freezing conditions in the Russian capital Moscow to call on Prime Minister Vladimir Putin to resign. They accused his government of ignoring the interests of common people. Protesters compared themselves to the pro-democracy movements that swept the presidents of Tunisia and Egypt from power. Pictures and effigies of Putin were waved as demonstrators chanted, "Shame, shame." Well, the world's biggest economies have reached a deal on how to track imbalances in the global economy. The issue has been blamed for making the 2008 financial crisis much worse than it might have been. China was initially reluctant, but came on board in the end. From Paris, where members of the G20 are meeting, here's Jackie Rowland.
Putting on a show of unity. The smiles of the family photo can't paper over the divisions within the G20. The world's leading financial powers agree that there are imbalances in the global economy, but it's much harder to agree on how to measure them. The sticking point was China. It didn't want its massive foreign currency reserves to be used as an indicator, but G20 members were able to reach a compromise.
This is a very complicated undertaking, and we need to be very careful to make sure we create a level playing field across countries, so that financial activity does not migrate to jurisdictions where standards are weaker or less vigorously enforced.
Ministers have also been focusing on commodity prices and food prices in particular. They want to find ways to protect the poorest countries against big price swings.
We have had a major convergence of views between different countries, developing countries and emerging countries, industrialized countries, to say that we had to go much farther in transparency, in the identification of stocks, in the use of agricultural land to respond to the need of population for food.
The financial crisis of 2008 was a global phenomenon, and ministers recognise that they'll need to take a global approach if another meltdown is to be avoided. The French hosts of this meeting have warned countries that they'll need to put self-interest to one side if the whole of the G20 is to achieve strong, sustainable growth. The long haggling over indicators raises a bigger question. If the members of the G20 found it so hard to agree on how to measure global imbalances, will they ever reach agreement on how to tackle those problems? Jackie Rowland, AlJazeera, Paris.
Protests have been staged outside branches of Barclays Bank, and that's in London. This follows revelations that in 2009, the world's third biggest bank paid only 2.4% of its annual profit as tax. Harry Smith has all the details.
What a greedy fat cat!
This was the scene outside one branch of Barclays Bank in central London as up to 50 protesters occupied the building. At one point, a bank employee tried to remove one of the protesters' banners, but succeeded only in tearing it in two before it was placed back against the window. It was a largely peaceful demonstration, but around 20 police officers entered the building after the bank was forced to close to customers. Unlike other banks, Barclays didn't have to be bailed out with billions of dollars of British taxpayers' money. But critics argue that they wouldn't be making the profits they now are if the British government hadn't part nationalised the banking system. In 2009, Barclays made profits of $7.47 billion, but paid only $183 million in UK corporation tax. That's just 2.4% of its profits at a time when public spending and services are being cut.
Corporation tax is meant to be 28%, they're paying 1 or 2%. I'm cross that there's massive cuts going on right across the country, and that they're getting away with not making their contribution to society.
I pay my tax, my husband, all my friends, we pay our tax. If they paid a fair amount of tax, then our services wouldn't need to be cut.
But one London expert says the protesters are wrong to home in on just 1 year's figures.
This particular year's figures is amazingly small, but that can be explained quite legitimately because companies are allowed to offset losses, and bear in mind the losses from the world's largest financial crisis we've had in a generation, that banks have been able to offset that against their profits.
Barclays also issued a statement saying the bank operates in 50 countries worldwide and complies with taxation law in every one. But that's a message many in Britain don't seem to be listening to. Harry Smith, AlJazeera, London.
To the U.S. now and back to Daljit Dhaliwal in Washington for news from the Americas. Daljit.
Doreen, thanks very much. Venezuela has dismissed Washington's calls for an international investigation into alleged human rights abuses by the government of Hugo Chavez. The investigation is a key demand of a group of Venezuelan students who have been on a hunger strike for more than 2 weeks. The government says it uses judges and prosecutors to target President Chavez's political rivals. Guatemala has lifted a state of siege in a drug-plagued region bordering Mexico. The Interior Minister says that the 2-month measure has driven down crime by half in the province of Alta Verapaz. The Guatemalan army had targeted the Mexican-based Zetas cartel, which took control of cocaine trafficking there in 2008. A 2-week-long transport strike in Colombia is now over. The government has agreed to cancel a cut in the minimum fee that truck drivers are paid for hauling cargo. Thousands of truck drivers and their families had been blocking roads in the capital, Bogotá, crippling parts of the city. Mexico's President Felipe Calderón has pledged to deploy additional troops to his country's northern borderlands. The area has become a battleground as security forces fight drug gangs vying for control of lucrative smuggling routes into the United States.
We know the difficult circumstances facing the people of the northeast border of the country, and this entire region devastated by criminals without remorse. And due to this irresponsible action of criminals from several groups, I announced that I have ordered 4 additional Army battalions to this region with the aim of backing up the work of the armed forces in these places.
For decades, Guerrero has been one of Mexico's most violent states as the army fought a long battle with guerrilla groups. But now in a remote highland region, villagers have established a system for local policing that is proving effective. Mariana Sanchez traveled to the southwest state to find out.
An eventful day in Jolochitan, a tiny village in the highlands of the state of Guerrero. Dozens of prisoners